Okay, this will be our first segment for Tuesday, and it's going to be a short segment because I'm going to blend into segments I have recorded for previous years, and at that point I'll give you more instructions on what the total number of segments will be for Tuesday. But this short segment will begin with where we left off in class today, and this deals with the behavior of the Germans concerning unconditional submarine warfare, which, if you'll recall, they began to use because of the stalemate uh, in the trenches and the attempt by both sides to come up with some way to get around that stalemate. And so the unconditional submarine warfare will ultimately lead to a very famous incident that brings the U.S. much, much closer to getting to war. And this dealt with a British ship called the Lusitania that had sailed from Great Britain to New York, and it was on its way from New York back to Great Britain when a U-boat sunk the passenger liner. It was sunk off the Irish coast on May 17, 1915, and as you can see here, almost 1,200 died, 128 of whom were Americans. Now, one of the interesting side notes to this, besides the rapid angry reaction that will come from the United States and, of course, the press, is that the German embassy actually put this advertisement that you see on the right in the New York newspapers prior to the sailing of the Lusitania. And the reason they did this was in order to try and strangle the ability of the British to get resupplied by sea. They had declared an entire area around the British Isles to be in a no-go zone for ships, and that if ships were seen there, they were liable to be sunk on sight. And so this was a notice that the German embassy put in New York newspapers. Many people at the time and since then have joked about the fact that by putting a notice in the paper that told Americans they could not travel there, they probably prompted more Americans to try to do so than might have otherwise. But whether that's the case or not, the sinking of the Lusitania, which was seen as the killing of innocent civilians, most of whom were definitely innocent civilians, was something that angered the United States and, of course, the press in a very big way. So what we end up with here is, as we look at both sides that are fighting in World War I, and we see how they affect us as a nation, this phrase comes into play. British actions keeping us from trading with the Germans and their allies hurt our pocketbooks, but German actions actually take American lives. After the sinking of the Lusitania, Wilson begins to openly lean towards supporting Great Britain, saying that withholding U.S. loans to the Allies would be the same as helping the Central Powers. So he's trying to push for the idea that the U.S. should loan money to the side that we see as the good guys eventually in World War I. And of course, those who were against this wanted him to stay neutral or believed that the U.S. just needed to stay out of the war, argued that if you loan money to someone, then you have to make sure they survive in order to have them repay it. And so this would be a step that would definitely not be a neutral one. Wilson proclaimed that any further such German actions on the high seas might force the U.S. to join the Allies. And although he's trying to claim that he's still neutral, Wilson's statements lead William Jennings Bryan, who truly was a pacifist, to resign, protesting his own president's statements, arguing that the U.S. seemed to be poised to support Great Britain. In the newspapers, of course, we see yellow journalism continuing. There were sensational claims of German espionage in the U.S. that began to appear in the papers. Very few, if any, of these had any relevance whatsoever. The Germans were having enough difficulty where they were, rather than trying to come to the United States and do some sort of terrorism or espionage. It's at this point that Roosevelt, who was still being paid attention to by the press, will make a statement calling Wilson chicken or yellow or cowardly when he refused to declare war immediately. As a little side note, when war is declared, Roosevelt begs, cajoles, and demands from Wilson that he be put in charge of a military unit, but Wilson will tell him, "You're a bit old, we're not going to send you." But Wilson will continue, even though being called a coward, to try and stay out of the conflict. Now, there was another sinking, although not of a ship that had a lot of Americans on it, but the sinking of another passenger liner that occurred almost immediately after the Lusitania. And at this point, the Germans realized they were really skating on thin ice, and the U.S. might join in, and that might have an impact on the overall war. So immediately after the sinking of the Sussex, which was the name of the second passenger liner that was sunk, the Germans signed a document and made a statement called the Sussex Pledge, which said that they would not use unconditional submarine warfare in the future. Wilson accepted this, and the crisis that might have led us to war during 1915 seemed to have calmed or passed. Now that leads us to the election of 1916, and as we talked about in class today, Wilson runs as the peace candidate, claiming that he kept us out of war, and he will defeat the Republican Charles Hughes, as the Republicans are still split over progressivism. And you can see the map here. The Republican base up in the north is still somewhat split. So Wilson continues on, and so this one he was elected in a sense on his own, although the Republicans were still splitting their own vote in a disagreement within the party over which way they should actually move. Now, of course, as you know, this is in a sense the road to war. The stalemate and bloodshed in Europe continue. The Russians will drop out of the war, and hopefully you're familiar with the story of how the Germans actually took Lenin from Paris. They smuggled him across the lines and kept him in a sealed rail car, and then sent him into northern Russia to lead the rebellion that will eventually become the Bolshevik Rebellion. And what occurs there is that the rebellion taking place within Russia causes the government itself to drop out of the war. And at that point, in fact, the Germans and the Russians signed a treaty called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and in this treaty not only did the Russians stop fighting, but they actually gave a whole bunch of land and money and other things to the Germans just to end the war on the Eastern Front. Of course, what they're doing is they're getting ready to fight their own civil war, which will be between the Red Russians and the White Russians, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and as you're familiar with, the Bolsheviks win, their color is red, and they turn the nation communist. So the Russians drop out of the war. Now, what does that mean for World War I overall? Well, it means all the troops here on the Eastern Front no longer need to worry about the Russian forces, and so the Germans are then able to bring a massive amount of firepower to the Western Front, and this is a buildup that will culminate in a huge offensive in the spring of 1917. And one in which, as the Germans were planning for it and bringing the troops from the east to the west, they brought them to have a sense that they were about to win the war. And this is a pretty important point. They think they're about to win because they're able to bring all these troops over from the east to the west. And so what this is going to lead to are the 3 steps for the U.S. to have before they enter into World War I. The first thing the Germans do is that they, in essence, say, we don't care if the Americans get involved anymore because it'll take them quite a while to get involved, and by then we will have won the war. So they want to try and do all they can to make the British as weak as possible. So they'll repudiate or end their Sussex Pledge and begin the resumption of unconditional submarine warfare on February 1st, 1917, knowing that this will probably bring the U.S. into war, but believing they'll be victorious before they can have an impact. The Bolshevik Revolution does occur in February of 1917, and this is important for the United States because once the monarchy is out of power in Russia, then even though the Russians were trying to get out of the war, as we talked about, technically they were still part of the alliance, and in order to ally ourselves with this entire group, the British, the French, the Turks, and the Russians, or not the Turks, but the Russians, it would be difficult for Wilson to explain that we were fighting a war for democracy if the monarchy of the Tsar of Russia was one of our allies, because it was definitely known as one that subdued their people and did not allow them to have equal rights. And so the fact that it removed the monarchy and put in place what, at least for a while, claimed to be a democracy, made it easier for us to join that alliance. And the final step is the Zimmerman Note or the Zimmerman Telegram. Now, this is a message that is sent to the German representative in Mexico City. You're probably familiar with it, but we'll get into some details here. It's actually sent from Berlin to the German embassy in Mexico City in January of 1917. Now remember, at this point the Germans believe that they're about to have this massive offensive that will win the war, and so this message was sent. However, it was intercepted by the British, who actually held it for a while, but released it to the U.S. press on March 3rd, 1917. And you can see the words that are here, but probably the biggest issue in this note was that it was offering to the Mexicans that if they would join in the war against us, in other words, join in on the side of the Germans, if we decided to get into war, that when the war was over, that the Germans would make sure that Mexico would be given back or allowed to reconquer all the lost territory that it had in the old Mexican War in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. And so this was something that the foreign minister in Mexico City was supposed to offer the Mexicans. Now, as you're probably very familiar, when Mexico heard about this, they didn't really want anything to do with it. They had no love lost for the United States, obviously, but they knew that that was a pretty ridiculous move. The important thing here about this note was that it was something that really pushed the American public into the desire to go to war with Germany. So what we'll end up with after these three steps is Wilson will ask Congress for war, and war will be declared on April 2nd, 1917. Now, as we talked about in class, this is supposed to be the war to end all wars. Wilson says that will be a war for the vindication of human right against autocratic governments backed by armed force. So here we see a lot of the things we talked about earlier in Wilson's foreign policy coming to fruition. He saw it as morally right. He saw it as good versus evil, with a very biblical idea. Of course, the evil being Germany and its actions. And then this was sort of an extension of the police power that we had seen used earlier in our own hemisphere, but now extending it to Europe itself. On the right, you see the actual Zimmerman note, which was sent in code but was broken by the British and then given to the American media. That leads us to the war. Allied spirits soar when they hear the U.S. is going to come in, but of course the Americans are slow to build up their military. We've talked all about that before. Eventually, mobilization of 24 million men will take place, and we'll have the second draft ever. We'll eventually have 3.7 million men under arms when the war actually ends. In this particular war, African American support was very strong. Both Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois were supporters of it. Now, the next thing is something called the amalgamation controversy, and this dealt with the commander of the American forces in World War I, who was John J. Pershing, who we had talked about before, Blackjack Pershing. And when he arrived in France, which is where our troops landed because that's where the Western Front was, he brought American troops with him, of course. Now, the French and the British wanted these troops to immediately fill the positions of French and British troops who had been killed, but Pershing refused, and Wilson backed him up. And Pershing, in essence, said, I don't want to put my men under the command of people who've already sacrificed all of their young men. If these men are going to die, they're going to die with American commanders. Now, there was a huge controversy because the British and French were very much in need of troops and believed that this is something that would hurt the war effort, but Pershing stuck to his guns, and this actually ended up taking place. The U.S. forces, of course, are not prepared with equipment, so for most of the war they'll be using French and British equipment, especially early on. But the real impact of the American forces were the 3 M's. They brought manpower, definitely positive morale, and I think I talked a little bit about that in class. The British and French troops are astounded at the attitude of the American forces, and momentum, because every day more and more Americans will be coming in, and more effort can then be put forward for the Allied cause. That leads us to the spring offensive of 1918, and what happens in that particular offensive is that, especially at 2 specific places, the American troops will stand firm and help to stop the German movement westward. The Germans actually pick up quite a bit of land, but not enough to make a difference, and we'll pick up with this with a second segment quickly.